All right. Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Huff. We're going to be talking about Unit 2.3 today. Specifically, we're going to talk about different forms of government. How do different countries set up their governments? What are the commonalities and what are the differences? And so we're going to explore that a little bit. Um, the first thing I want to look at uh, just kind of a map here that shows some different ways that countries have set up their government. So, for example, United States here we see is a constitution-based federal republic, and I know right now that might be confusing. We're actually going to talk about exactly what that means. The UK, which is Great Britain and Northern Ireland, they use constitutional monarchy. China is a communist state. North Korea is a communist state with a dictatorship. And Iran is something called a theocracy. So we're going to look at some of these different ways of setting up government, and that's what we're going to look at in this unit. Okay. So the first thing to be aware of is that there's different ways of distributing power geographically within a country. So, for example, in the United States, we have different forms of government, right? We have a state government here in South Carolina, but we also have a central government in Washington, D.C. And that's a very specific type of government. It's called a federal system. A federal system is one where power is shared between a central government and local governments. So in the United States, we have that. You see it here, right here, federal government. Okay. Another way of setting up governments is something called a unitary government. And in a unitary government, all you have is the central government. And that's actually a much more common way to set up a government. Most countries in the world are unitary. There's not a difference between the federal and the state. It's all run by the central government. Now, in some of these unitary governments, you will see that they do have local governments, that they'll have a city or a county government, but all of that is controlled completely by the central government. In a federal system, power is shared. So there are some things that the states can do that the federal government doesn't have any control over. And that's what makes our system here in the United States different from a lot of countries. You also have something called a confederate government, and we won't spend too much time on that because there are no confederate governments today in the world. Some people consider the European Union a form of a confederate government, but for the most part, that doesn't exist anymore. But actually, in the United States, there were two Confederate types of government. One was something called the Articles of Confederation, which we will talk about later, and then one, very briefly, the Confederate States of America during the U.S. Civil War, which we'll talk about also. Okay, but but the big thing to know is the difference between a unitary government and a federal government. And the big difference there is that in a federal government, you have a central government sharing power with local governments. Okay. All right. So we talked about in the last slide how power is distributed. Now we're going to talk about here who has the power, who has control. In the United States, for example, we have a democracy that's ruled by the people. Demo is Greek for people. We'll talk about that actually in the next slide. But um, around the world, there are different ways of setting up governments where the power is not rested in the people. An autocracy, for example, auto means one, so autocracy is rule in the power of one person or one group. Monarchy is a system of government where there's a king or a queen. We won't talk too much about that, but a theocracy is a good term to know. A theocracy is ruled by the church, by religion. And a great example of that, we saw that here is Iran. Okay, Iran is a theocracy, meaning that the religion rules Iran. So that's a theocracy. All right, next slide. Um, we talked about the United States being a democracy, but it's not an actual what we call direct democracy. A direct democracy is very, very difficult to achieve because a direct democracy means that the people have direct control over every decision, right? We live in a democracy in the United States, but we don't control everything that the government does. Instead, what we have representatives. We elect people to serve in Congress, to serve in the Senate, to serve in the House of Representatives, to go and make our decisions for us. We call that a representative democracy. Another term for that is a republic. Okay, and specifically, the United States is a democratic republic, meaning that it was a republic with democracy elements. The representatives are elected by the people. Okay, so a direct democracy is very, very rare. There are some places, very, very small places around the world where this is possible, but for the most part, it doesn't exist. Okay, we will see at the very beginnings of what will become the United States, like in New England and some of those colonies, like uh, Massachusetts Bay or Plymouth, they had versions of direct democracies. But like I said, today it's just not very possible. It's not practical for every person to weigh in on every decision. Okay, so instead we have more indirect democracy or rule by representatives. Okay, all right. In the United States, we have what's called a presidential system. It makes sense. We have a president, but not all democracies are set up this way. In fact, a lot of democracies are set up as what we call parliamentary governments. And we're going to look at the difference of that. I want you to look at this here chart. This chart actually is this one right here, just blown up. Okay. So the difference between a parliamentary system and a presidential system has to do with the relationship between the legislative branch and the chief executive. Okay. The legislative branch, we'll talk a lot more about this later in the year, but the legislative branch is the branch of government that makes laws, that makes decisions. Okay. The chief executive is the person who actually puts those laws into place. In the United States, that chief executive is called the president. In the UK, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, the chief executive is called the prime minister. Okay. But the real difference between a presidential system and a parliamentary system, like I said, is the relationship between the legislative and chief executive. In the presidential system like we have today, the legislative branch and chief executive are separate powers. Okay. The legislature does its thing and the chief executive does its thing, and they kind of have to work together to make things happen. Okay. In a parliamentary system, the legislative branch, look here, actually chooses the chief executive. So the legislative branch has power over the chief executive. In a presidential system where power is split between the legislative, the group that makes the laws, and the executive, the person that actually puts the laws into place, okay, is separate in a presidential system. All right. All right, so I want us to go through and do just a quick little check here to see if we kind of understand the difference between a presidential and parliamentary system. So we're going to click Start, and that actually is just going to pop up this little thing right here. You can do this along with me if you'd like. Okay, so let's look at this first one. Executive branch contains members of the legislative branch. Okay, does that sound like a presidential system or a parliamentary system? Now, look at the chart again. In a presidential system, the legislative and chief executive are separate. In a parliamentary system, they're not separate. Okay, the legislative actually chooses the executive, and usually in a parliamentary system, the legislative will choose an executive out of the legislature. So this first one, executive branch contains members of the legislative, is parliamentary. Okay. Chief executive is chosen by the legislative branch, does not serve a fixed term, and is under direct control of the legislative branch. Again, going back to our thing, under direct control, chosen by the legislative branch, that's the parliamentary again. Okay. Chief executive is chosen by the people, serves a fixed term, and is not under direct control of the legislative branch. Not under direct control of the legislative branch and chosen by the people. So if we go back here and look again, look who in the presidential system chooses the executive. It's chosen by the voters, by the people. Okay. In a parliamentary system, the executive is chosen by the legislative branch. Okay. So this is going to be presidential here. Executive and legislative branches are independent and co-equal. Again, go back to our chart. Okay, the legislative and the chief executive, they are separate here in a presidential system, not in a parliamentary system. So our answer on this last one is going to be presidential also. Okay, so there's your answers there. All right. Now, slide 7 involves watching a video and answering some questions. I'm going to let you do that on your own, but hopefully some of the things that we've talked about will make that make sense. Okay. And then we're going to go on straight to the quick check. We'll just kind of walk through. We'll talk about this, and then you can answer the questions. Okay. A political system that separates the lawmaking and law enforcing branches is called what? Again, lawmaking is the legislative. It's like in the United States, that's the Congress. Law enforcing is the executive branch. That's like in the United States, that would be the president. In the UK, that would be the prime minister. Okay. So where the legislative and the executive are separate, what is that? We talked about that. If you want to go back and look at this chart to kind of remind yourself, you can. Okay. I'll let you figure that out. Okay. Question 2. Which of the following statements best describes a federal system of government? Okay. Remember the federal system, we talked about those 3 types of governments in terms of how power is spread out geographically. We had the unitary system, we had the federal system, and we had the confederate system. Okay, but this talks about the federal system. Is a federal system independent states that form an alliance and give up clearly defined and limited powers to a national government? Is a federal system the national government that holds all the power, creating and abolishing local governments as it wishes? Is a federal system state or regional governments that share power with a national government? Again, share power is key there. Or is a federal system states hold all the power and there's no central government? Well, I'll give you a hint. In the United States today, we have a federal system. Remember, we have a central government that does some things, and we have state governments that do some things. And they share power. It is not one is more important than the other. Is that they in certain things they share power. So that'll help you answer number 2. All right. Which forms of government are most associated with the United States? Okay. Well, look at this here. Do you see all 4 has democratic in it? So that will tell me that democratic is probably right. Okay. So I don't have to look at that. All right. Let's look at these other ones. Republican, monarchic, oligarchic. Okay. We didn't even talk about oligarchic. We talked about monarchic and Republican. Remember, Republican means representative. That's that indirect democracy. Do we have that? Absolutely. Okay. Then you've got to figure out, well, do we have a federal or a unitary system? Again, we talked about that. If you're not sure, if you need to review that, go back to slide 2. That'll help you figure that out. Okay. And then finally, presidential or parliamentary. And we talked about that with this slide here. Okay. So you might want to go back and look at that again before you answer. Okay, and in which way does a dictatorship differ from a democracy? Okay, in a dictatorship, another way of saying this is an autocracy, but a dictatorship, the power is held by one person and political party. Leaders in a dictatorship are always democratically elected. Dictatorships have short-term limits on their rule. Or a democracy exists if the people can vote regardless if the ballot contains only one candidate or party. Okay, and I'll give you a hint, guys. The key to this is dictatorship is ruled by one person. Okay, so that's it. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully that made some sense. I encourage you to go through, click some of these links, guys. Go back and actually read the textbook. You definitely want to watch the video on number 7. Okay, because that'll help you answer some of those questions. But that's basically it for 2-3. Hope that you've enjoyed this. Please let me know. Let us know if you have any questions, and hope you have a great day.